Hello, welcome back to the YouTube video. Today I'm doing 25.23 top lane tier list, served of content. Like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. Most notably, we saw the addition of Zahin to the game. Zahin, however you pronounce it. He is probably overpowered to the point where he is most likely the best champion, just generally, in the game at the moment. He launched with a relatively high win rate, which is surprising for a champion. But honestly, I'm not as surprised. His mastery curve doesn't look to be that insane. Like, I've put some games into him, and I don't think he has the same, like, level of skill necessary to pilot that something like a Riven or an Ambessa might have. So, it'd be interesting to see down the line how he kind of lands. There's been, like, experimentation with builds, things like Stride Breaker, Eclipse, Sundered Sky, Trinity. There's, like, loads of different variations kind of out there at the moment. I'd recommend just putting games into him more than anything, and then kind of builds will end up narrowing down over time. I do think the Trinity looks to be like the default one at the moment, but some of the other ones do put out relatively good statistics in the right games. But yeah, I imagine he'll probably get hotfix nerfed across this patch, or he will be nerfed in the next patch. He definitely looks to be way too strong at the moment, and yeah, he's fun. I would recommend putting games into him if you can get him. He is being like banned quite a bit though, so just be aware of that. Other changes include the likes of Swain, who got buffed primarily for support, but it does indirectly buff top lane. Volibear got a compensation buff. They ended up going they over-nerfed jungle, under-buffed top, so they basically just wanted to give him back something, so he got free base AD. Does help him with last hits, helps him with like early game skirmishes, so definitely like going to be meaningful. Rek'Sai got nerfed for top lane. Unfortunate to see, as she really wasn't putting out insane like numbers in top lane, but they are aware it's a pretty unhealthy playstyle to support long term, so ended up taking a relatively large swing at it. I still think she's playable, but probably not the kind of pick I'd recommend unless you're very comfortable with the champion. Mundo got buffed. Well, he got nerfed in a bug fix, but they gave him a lot of power back in his E, and it looks to be very positive for the champion, so he's definitely in a more reasonable spot now for top lane. And Vladimir received a pretty sizable nerf, mostly focused on top lane, as top lane Vladimir had been performing quite well for a while, and they wanted to kind of bring it back a bit more in line. They took away 3 base armor and like 7 base HP. The HP value doesn't really matter that much, but 3 base armor is very meaningful in a lot of the like AD matchups in the top lane. He actually looks to have lost a decent chunk, so that is something to observe when playing the champion, and generally those are like the core changes this patch. Let's get into it. So the D tier then, I have removed Skarner. Skarner top really did not pick up the play rate, which I reckon they wanted. They mostly were trying to go for jungle Skarner to be better. The buffs to kind of bring him more in line this patch also just look to not be enough. Like, I think he'll probably get buffed again in 25.24. Generally though, for top lane, he still just doesn't perform well enough, and they're gonna have to definitely take another swing if they want to like bring him more in line with like other top laners. The other champions in the D tier consist of the same things, for likes of your Udyr, who still really heavily underperforms in the top lane, Master Yi, who has received a decent bump in player base, but still underperforms as well. Very reliant on being volatile and like very explosive dive potential. And if you're not comfortable with that very like snowbally, like when I say hoping, like you need to know your limits. And if you don't and you mess it up, you will just end up running it down in the game. So it's definitely I'd say a champion which, unless you're an OTP, is probably just a must avoid for the most part. Cassante still heavily underperforms in average solo queue. This, I mean, even with all the nerfs that he received recently through like Biscuits being nerfed, Second Wind being nerfed, D-Shield being nerfed, he wasn't performing well, and like all these nerfs have definitely made him a lot more assailable. That being said, he's still obviously pretty unassailable in lane. That is one of the strengths of the champion. It's why he performs quite well in elite brackets. I say well, he still underperforms in elite brackets, but like he feels frustrating in elite brackets. In lower brackets, people will pilot the champion worse, and he will be outscaled more, I mean, like faster a lot of the time, which is why he is a pick which I just don't really recommend at the moment. And Maokai and Smolder wrap up the D tier. Smolder, I think, is like a niche counter pick. You can make him work, but he requires so much to really be valuable, and unless you don't like already have the time into him, he just ends up not really worth like investing time into. Like, I'd recommend just other things which are a bit more like general and a bit more broad. And Maokai, I don't really know why I include Maokai still in the top lane tier list. I guess there's this like part of me which wishes he was once again viable. Right now, he's just bad. Like, he is too weak across like the early game. Like, his mana costs are too high, and generally like the item system just isn't that good for him in top lane at the moment. And yeah, it leads to him being a pretty weak option. I have him in the D tier. The C tier then. So we lead off with Trundle. Definitely one of his weakest states for top lane at the moment. Could probably be bumped down to the D tier, and it wouldn't be like that surprising. This is for like average brackets, so I do think the merit of just being relatively simplistic and having a clear plan in winning the game is a strength of the champion. That being said, though, I wouldn't recommend him. This is basically for those people who really enjoy the champion and still want to play him. If you don't, then yeah, he just ends up not really being worth it at the moment. Tahm Kench has been over-nerfed. It kind of leaves him in this pretty undesirable state, even though he is better in these brackets. He's still just not that great of a champion. Kayn, I am in the C tier. I think if you are like comfortable with the play pattern, I don't think he's bad. Honestly, he's probably a champion where sure if you're like an OTP and you know how to like kind of work around the proxying and you understand the strengths of the champion in lane and like the kind of what form you want within the game, I think he can work quite well. That being said though, if you're not willing to put the time into him, he probably just ends up being a bit of a non-factor, but he's definitely there for like the people who enjoy the unique playstyle of the pick. Nah is just a bit weak at the moment. He's really struggled over this season with like the grasp nerfs. I think grasp being nerfed for ranged champions really left him with in a state of not having a great identity for like what he wants. Like Fleet has also been really heavily nerfed for ranged champions, so Na's kind of just been left in this pretty neglected state. I think they could have buffed him a bit harder back when they did buff him. Generally though, I think he suffers with the itemization system, and I genuinely think he suffers with the rune system at the moment, and hopefully next season will be a lot better for him, because right now he's in this pretty undesirable state. Varus, I think this champion, if you're very comfortable on it, can be really oppressive. Like, there are very few champions which can kind of deal with his oppressive nature early on to the game. But you're really susceptible to being ganked. Ganks, you don't scale amazingly well, like, unless you're really, really ahead of the curve. And I think that is definitely a vulnerability of the champion. That being said, though, I think if you're comfortable with the pick, he's not bad. Like, he actually puts out pretty good numbers in a lot of situations, so I have him towards the higher end of the C tier. Like, I think whereas maybe some of the other picks are a bit less desirable, I think if you're comfortable with like your Varuses and your Kaynes and the archetype of the champion, you can definitely make them work in the right situations. Volibear, even with the buff, still seems to be a bit under the bar. I might bump him up to the B tier next patch. I'm going to have him towards the high end of the C tier for the moment though, as like I'm waiting to kind of see how he kind of readjusts with like some of the builds and some of the other things kind of like changing around him. So yeah, Volibear, gonna have him in the top of the C tier at the moment. Might get bumped up to the B tier next patch. If you'd enjoy him, I'd put some games into him, see how he kind of feels, and if you can like make him work, then yeah, you can continue playing him. If you can't, then yeah, he probably just ends up being a champion you're still not going to consider at the moment. Rek'Sai, I'm gonna put her towards the lower end of the C tier. She's just not that desirable of a champion to be playing. She's relatively low agency, and the recent nerf just it hurts the part of the game where you want, like, the reason why you're playing her, and I think that just makes her a really undesirable champion. If you like the pick and you want to use her as a counter pick, that's fine, but outside of that, I just wouldn't really recommend it. Nasus has just been weak for a while now. This is the Elo bracket he performs best in, and I do think if you find the right matchups for the champion, then he can be fine, but he's too predicated on it at the moment, and it just makes him a very undesirable champion to recommend. I think if they buffed him, he could genuinely once again find his spot within the meta, but for the moment, yeah, just an undesirable top laner. Yasuo and Yone both sit within the C tier. Not so much because they are bad champions. I think both, in the case of Yone, his recent buffs have definitely helped him, but he still is kind of matchup dependent and knowledge dependent. If you're not comfortable with the champion, then you're just not really going to consider him as an option. And Yasuo, also another, you need to, you want the specific matchups, like your ranged matchups traditionally, and you want a lot of comfort within the pick. They're the kind of champions where if you already have the mastery on them in the mid lane, and you can bring them to the top lane, they're pretty solid options. If you're not, and you're just learning them from the just raw as top lane options, then they just end up being pretty kind of, they're time sinks more than anything, and I wouldn't really recommend them in the current state of the season, because obviously we're towards the end of the year now. You've kind of missed the boat if you want to be playing these champions, because yeah, they require a lot of time investment for the most part. Kind of same goes for your Jaces, your Gangplanks, your Ambessas, and your Jace, Gangplank, and Ambessa, I'll have them as C tier options. I think Trainer is a different story, but case of Ambessa, I don't think she's bad in the top lane, but the recent nerfs towards Cookies, Second Wind, D-Shield, all impact her. She was someone who ran all of those three things, and Ambessa's just a hard champion to play. It's why she just performs worse in average brackets. I think the higher up you go, the better she becomes as an option. She's one of the best options in Elite for that matter, and she pays for tax in lower brackets. That's why she is towards the lower end. I mean, that's why she is in the C tier here. Case of Gangplank and Jace, they're just massive time sinks. If you're willing to borderline OTP these champions, they can be really rewarding. If you're not, not, then they just end up being non-factors. You should just not consider these champions because, yeah, they require so much mastery, understanding like Gangplank's like barrel rotations and how to really like maximize the damage of the champion. And in the case of Jace, like, he is one of the hardest champions to play in the entire game. You need to understand how to rotate 6 abilities precisely to really like get value out of the pick, and if you don't, then you just end up running it down, which is why he is a champion I just don't particularly recommend like playing unless you are willing to sink hundreds, 200s games worth into him. In the case of Tryndamere, he's just not amazing at the moment, and enough to some of the sustain options did affect him. The current archetype of just splitting is not in its greatest state. I think that's probably healthy, to be honest. Like, there are a lot of champions just generally, like, can split for the most part, which is why, like, champions primarily built for the archetype just aren't as good at the moment. That being said, though, I don't think Tryndamere is a bad champion. I think if you want to put time to him, that's perfectly reasonable. I just think his play pattern ends up being a bit, I don't know, not amazing at the moment. Like, there's not a lot to add on to him. Like, you can honestly consider him a beta champion if you want to. He's very frustrating. Like, there's loads of things just kind of floating around him at the moment. Is top lane maybe his worst of his 3 roles? Possibly. Like, I think mid lane Tryndamere is not bad. I think jungle Tryndamere is not bad. So, yeah, definitely something to consider in that regard. Into the beta then, we lead off with Wukong, who is fine. I think if you're an OTP, you'll probably play him. If you're not, then he just ends up not really being a considerable factor because he is once again one of those champions which, like, you'll have him as a niche pick within your pool, which you want to play into maybe some of the AD champions where you know you can kind of like stat check them and be a bit of a nuisance in lane. So outside of that, not really a considerable like factor. It'd be nice maybe to see some love come towards Wukong lane because I think Wukong lane has definitely been neglected for like Wukong jungle over time, and I think that has definitely maybe led to some frustrations with the current state of the champion. Camille is, I think, fine in the right matchups. Like, I don't mind a Camille. I think if you're like comfortable with the champion, you want to play her into X matchup, that's perfectly reasonable. Do I think she's great generally? No, I think she ends up being punished a bit too hard in like certain states. But if you've put the time into her, she can be very rewarding in the right spots. And yeah, it's just about picking those spots. If you haven't put the time into her, then yeah, she probably just ends up being not very considerable, very much of a considerable option. Silas, he's a counter pick option in the top lane. There's not much more to go on other than that. If you played him before, you'll probably pick him in like your Nars or your Malphite matchups. Outside of that, though, yeah, he probably just ends up being not something you really consider. It's why I have him in the beta at the moment, because he can be valuable in the right spots, but kind of whatever in others. Swain, I have him in the beta. The recent buffs help him a lot. Honestly, Swain might even be able to be pushed into the A tier. I should put some games into Swain. I actually like Swain as a champion. I played him a lot when I used to play mid lane. And these days, though, like, I played like mostly tanks. I mean, if you ever like follow me on like, I mean, whatever. Anyway, yeah, Swain is like a pretty solid champion now. The recent buffs helped him, and I would consider him if you are someone who likes that archetype of champion. Some of the other AP options include your Akalis and your... Actually, I remember I grouped all the AP champions. So yeah, Akali, I think she's a great assassin to learn, and honestly, she's got a lot of decent matchups in the top lane, so definitely something to consider in that regard. Gragas, I think he is not in his greatest state, but generally not bad. Like, the Lost Chapter into Protobelt build, it seems to be pretty solid as an option. You can still go like the Roa Fimbulwinter variant. It just ends up being a bit lower agency, and just generally not as good at the moment, so not really something I would recommend considering. But if you like playing the Lost Chapter Protobelt build, he's solid. He's a fine AP champion in that regard. Rumble, doing pretty well for general solo queue at the moment. The recent changes have like actually helped him with one other thing here, so that's like nice to see, I guess. And yeah, I mean, he's still very oppressive in lane, and generally he's still going to be a competitively skewed champion, but I think if like in his current state, he's a lot more approachable. So if you want to put time into Rumble, I think now is one of the better states he's been in for that, because of like some of the bug fixes and some of the adjustments they've done to him in more recent times. Rise, he's been a pretty solid AP top laner for a while now. I think if you want to consider him, he's like fine as an option. He's probably not in his best state for top lane, which is like funny to say, because like Rise top has actually genuinely been like really good at certain points, but more recently he's ended up being a bit more pro-jailed. Roa nerfs have impacted him a bit more than some of the other top laners, so yeah, he's definitely suffered in that regard, but I still think he's a pretty solid option if you want to put time into him. Aurora underperforms for like average bracket. She really is like a bit too elite skewed at the moment. I think her general audience would be better served if she was a bit more average skewed. Whether that's something like will change longer term, I don't know. Honestly, they might just be happy with the current state she's in. But for both mid lane and top lane, she does underperform in average brackets. You want to be comfortable with the champion. Her ult's a pretty unique ability, and she relies a bit more on like being a bit of a like lane bully, which ends up being this kind of like elite skew on her. So yeah, that's definitely something to like recognize when playing the champion. So your B tier options include, oh yeah, Vladimir now. Vladimir I've dropped down to the B tier. He's lost a lot, actually. Like, a lot of the AD matchups are going to be more punishing for him. I mean, obviously, the one I can just take off the top of my head is, like, Urgot Vladimir, for example. I think Urgot might genuinely be able to play that one considerably more now with that kind of a nerf to the champion, because he's a bit more assailable early on. And, like, you're not going to be as consistently like if Urgot E flashes you, for example, you are going to more likely die in that situation than being able to pull and kind of like fight back a bit more. So yeah, there are going to be spots where that is going to be meaningful. So beware when you are playing this champion that yeah, you're going to be a bit more burstable against like your Ambesses, your Urgots, your Tryndamere. I mean, I'm just looking off the list, but there are other AD champions. Generally, like the AD pool is going to have a better time killing you. So yeah, just something to know in that regard. Ornn, he's fine. I'm not the biggest fan of Ornn at the moment. I think he's definitely like pretty weak in lane in a lot of matchups. He's also very counterable. A lot of popular champions or just general like champion archetypes aren't great for him at the moment. That being said though, the recent jungle buffs are nice for him. It obviously means more for jungle Ornn, but top lane Ornn, if you want to like help with an objective, if you want to take a camp away, if you are generally just looking to be, I mean, just do more on the map, it helps him. So yeah, I mean, it's something there, but Ornn, I think, yeah, I mean, like as a dual flex, you could probably play him, but like, I don't know, he's too reliant on certain matchups, and I think there are just better tanks in the current meta to be playing, especially in solo queue. Riven sits within the B tier. If you're an OTP, she's still a really good option. If you're not, then she ends up being this non-factor. You basically, I mean, you have to be an OTP to be playing Riven at the moment, because she is just that kind of champion. She kind of always will be. The B tier, I mean, tier, like, aside, it doesn't really matter where I place her, because yeah, you just need to have had like 100, 200 games to be comfortable on this champion to like make her work. Darius sits within the B tier. He's fine. Once again, I say this every patch, but like a lot of the top end of the B tier and the low end of the A tier are just solid options. If you find the matchups that you like playing these champions, then they can be pretty good. I don't think they're like good to like main pool at the moment, unless you're like an OTP of the champion, because I do think they can have like situations where they struggle, or like general archetypes can be a bit more punishing for them, and I think Darius can kind of like fit into that kind of state at the moment. Being top, benefited from a lot of the sustain nerfs, definitely able to harass a lot of champions out, and has her kind of like niche net of like matchups where you want to be playing her into, usually like your tanks, where you can freely scale up, you can kind of bully them out of lane without really being that assailable, and yeah, I think that's where she really shines as a champion. Obviously, primarily played by like OTPs and people who are very comfortable in the champion, because you do have some level of vulnerability to ganks, and she is sometimes like reliant on outplay potential, which is going to be definitely like a OTP kind of like comfort zone. So something to note in that regard. Aatrox, it's weird having him in the B tier, because I don't actually think he's a B tier champion. I just know that a lot of people itemize him incorrectly at the moment. Unlike Mel, where I traditionally just have Mel lower on tier list, because most people were Q-maxing on her, when E-max was like clearly better, at least in the previous patch. This patch, I haven't actually looked at the data yet, but like Mel received some changes, so there is like some like value to going and looking at the changes and then like deciphering what you want to kind of like go on the champion now. Anyway, Aatrox, most people don't go Sundered Sky. Sundered Sky is by far and away like, or I mean, I say by far and away. There are lots of good items on Aatrox which I think are a bit more unexplored, but Sundered Sky looks to be very clearly better than like your Eclipse and your Showdrum rushes, which most Aatrox mains and just generally Aatrox players still do at the moment, which is why the champion ends up being a bit weaker. I still recommend trying Grasp Sundered Sky. It looks to still be his best way to go by quite a margin. It's what people traditionally go in competitive and in elite brackets as well, so something to note in that regard. And I do think if you do that, then yeah, he becomes more of an A tier champion. So for the low end of the A tier then, I'm adding Mundo here. He is being bumped from the C tier to the A tier. Mundo, last patch, was very undesirable to play. They took a genuinely large amount of power out of the champion, and this patch they gave him a large amount of power back. So yeah, I bumped him back up to the A tier. He's not like a high A tier option. I think that they could have gone maybe even harder, but he's definitely a lot more of appealing to play again. He is relatively simplistic, has a clear scaling win condition, and if you find the matchups which you want to take him into, he is very rewarding in those spots. So I think A tier suits him quite nicely as an option. Poppy, I have here. I think as like a situationally like strong counter pick, she can work quite nicely. Definitely had a lot of power siphoned of her early game, so that is something you do need to note. Albeit her early game is still quite oppressive in the right situations. Since the Sky looks to be very nice on her as like her first item. Traditionally, you're picking up her tier early because she does suffer from mana problems, and I think if you find the right matchups, she's a pretty solid top lane option. I have her in the A tier as like a low A tier option because, yeah, I think that's kind of where she deserves to be as a champion. Warwick, I am in the A tier. He's kind of niche these days. There was like, I mean, during like MSI, I mean, you specifically, I mean, if you, I mean, anyway, Warwick had a spike in popularity towards the beginning of this year. He ended up being nerfed quite aggressively. They didn't like how frustrating the champion was to play against, and it's definitely brought him more in line. I think if you're comfortable with the pick, you'll have the matchups which you're comfortable taking him into. Think for likes of Ambessa, for example. It's still a very Warwick favoured matchup, and that was something which was cropping up quite a bit at the beginning of the year. Outside of that, though, there are definitely a lot of matchups where you can't really exploit them with the champion. Once again, Argot Warwick is another very easy example of a matchup which you really don't want to be playing Warwick into. It is a really bad Warwick matchup. So yeah, it's something to note in that regard. Alawi sits from the A tier into her tank matchups, and if you're comfortable with the champion, she is incredibly oppressive. There is a reason why she does so well in those matchups, and just the overwhelming amount of damage and sustain she can provide against like those like sustained matchups, like your Scions, for example. She makes her really solid as an option. So definitely something to note when playing with champion. I think if you're comfortable with the pick though, she still performs pretty solid generally in average brackets. The higher up you go, the more people punish your like archetype of playstyle, so that is just something to note. I don't think she translates that well into higher brackets of play. Shen, I think is a counterpick, like a counterpick tank option. He deserves a spot within the A tier. I don't think he's in his greatest state at the moment, but I think it's like a champion within your pool which you can utilize to effectively nullify some of the like auto attack based matchups or matchups which can't really punish you for like ulting. Just like using your ult around the map. I think like Cassante, for example. I really like playing Shen as like a counterpick into Cassante in scrims. That is one of my like actually like favorite matchups. I would play Gnar if he was better, but yeah, Shen perfectly reasonable. Actually has good like angles to kill, especially in the early lane where like Shen's like mixed damage can be quite rewarding in that aspect. Anyway, Shen, yeah, I think he's pretty solid as like an A tier champion at the moment. Zach Cho'Gath also in this A tier section. I think Zach has the factor that he is pretty niche. Most people don't understand how to play him, play against him that well, because his like unpopularity kind of like led to that. I think Alois is playing him at the moment, so if you kind of want to learn from someone, that's always a good recommendation and a good start. Generally though, yeah, I think the champ's pretty solid at the moment. I think if you're comfortable with the playstyle, then he can definitely be quite good in his current state. Cho'Gath, I like him as a counterpick to the likes of Scion, who is definitely quite popular at the moment. There are other matchups which you can work quite nicely into. What's the other one? Yorick, that's another one where you can sometimes take for Cho'Gath. Generally though, I think he's a good scaling tank at the moment. One of the best scaling tanks, in fact. And yeah, I'd say he sits quite nicely as like an A tier option. Quinn, yeah, solid AD auto attacker. I think if you're comfortable with the play pattern, you'll play it. If not, then you probably won't play it. She probably ends up being a bit kind of like non-consideration. Probably played by OTPs. She's pretty unpopular. Most people don't like playing her. Yorick sits within the A tier. I think as like a split pushing champion, as like one of the champions of the split push archetype, he's one of the better options. There are lots of matchups which really struggle against Yorick at the moment. Like the changes they did to his ghouls make them a lot tankier in certain situations. So that is definitely something to note. He does have counter matchups, and which he can definitely struggle into, and especially with like the sustained nerfs. I think he does a lot worse into some of the ranged options which you could have taken him into before. But generally, though, I'd say he's a pretty solid A2 option at the moment. Pantheon, I think for just like a pretty aggressive early game point and click AD AD option, he works quite nicely. If you're comfortable with the pick, then you'll probably play him. If you're not, then I'd just go Renekton. I think Renekton just ends up being the kind of like other side of the coin, where he's also a point and click AD bruiser in the top lane, except from he is more scum. Well, Skirmish Roller. He has more durability, and it enables him to just be a bit more effective on some of the objective fights, and I think that is a very clear, like, strength of the champion, and it makes him a bit more approachable as an option. Whereas Pantheon, you're a bit more reliant on, like, snowballing your early advantages, and that can definitely be punishable, especially in, like, average brackets. So I would recommend Renekton over him, but it just comes down to your comfort more than anything. Your AP options within the A tier include the likes of Heimerdinger, Teemo, Cassiopeia. I don't know. No, okay, Cassiopeia, I still have it. Gwen, like, kind of around this area. Heimerdinger, that's Mordekaiser. Heimerdinger, I have Cassiopeia kind of around this area, so I'll, like, include her. And Kennen. Anyway, okay, so let's go through these champions. Gwen, I think, has kind of gone back to being this great counterpick into tank matchups. She scales a lot better now, but is definitely a lot more assailable into early game. That is, like, for consideration of when playing the pick now. Teemo is great for, like, his general, like, strength across the game. He can harass people quite nicely early on to the game. Scales relatively well with his shrooms, and I think just having a relatively solid break points with, like, your items and generally just, like, clear strengths makes him quite approachable as a champion. He's obviously very frustrating for certain matchups to deal with. Heimerdinger, I don't really recommend him unless you're willing to put a decent chunk of time into him, because he's quite unique in the way he functions. That being said, though, there are a lot of matchups where Heimerdinger can completely nullify them as picks. So I think if you're willing to sink the time into him, he can be really rewarding in that aspect. Kennen has been a slept-on AP option for a while now, genuinely really strong in, like, your Jax matchups, for example. Cassiopeia could probably be bumped up to the S tier. She's in a really good state at the moment, and her recent buffs to her mana and her E damage were really, really big, so don't sleep on her. I think she's probably my top recommendation for, like, an AD option in the A tier at the moment, so yeah, I kind of have her up here as a pick. Your options within the A tier include the likes of Garen, Kled, and there's one more, and Jax. So in the case of Kled, I could maybe bump him up to the S tier. I think he's probably deserving of this promotion now. He is doing really well in his current state, so I'll talk a bit more in depth once I've covered these champions. So in the case of Jax, the reason why I don't have him in the S tier is he definitely has some, like, matchups where he really struggles. He is also a bit elite skewed in his current state. I think if you're willing to put the time into him, he ends up being a great champion to have within your pool. But yeah, there are situations where he can definitely struggle a bit more as a pick. In the case of Garen, he's definitely doing a lot better now. The recent buffs to his E total AD ratio allows him to more consistently get people down to the, like, threshold where you can ult them, and yeah, just being able to do a bit more damage is very meaningful on this champion. And he's got a pretty low accessible mastery curve, and if you just want to pick him as, like, a counter pick in some certain situations, I think he becomes a bit more rewarding in that aspect. You're still looking at your stride breaker PD kind of builds. There are things which kind of, like, are a bit more optimal in now for, like, third item. You still see your Mortal Reminders, your LDRs, and your IE sometimes, but things like Shojin seem to be a lot more appealing on the champion now, so definitely, unlike Deadman, still, like, there are just more build considerations to kind of opt into on this champion. Anyway, Kled, I've promoted him up to the S tier. He is doing really well at the moment. He generally is quite hard to take down. Being able to consistently remount a lot easier with the recent changes has made him a real nuisance within the top lane. He's definitely not as bursty as he used to be, which is, I'd say, a pretty punishing factor of the champion, because looking for isolated solo kills, you're definitely not going to have that same level of, like, dive threat as before. That being said, though, in team fights as this, like, disrupting champion, he's definitely really found his footing. I originally didn't like the kind of shape of the champion they'd gone for, like, through... It just felt like he couldn't really do enough in the game, but I think as people have kind of grown more accustomed to the build, and, like, that Titanic Hullbreaker or Titanic Steric or Titanic Overlords, like, we've seen, like, variations kind of pop up, does give him so much durability to work with. So yeah, definitely very meaningful in that regard. The other champions within the S tier include the likes of Aurelion Fiora, who I still have in this, like, niche bracket. Well, I say niche bracket, in this, like, different bracket, I'd say, where they are the best champions to invest time into. I think they are incredible solo queue options at the moment. Are they fair to put in the, like, the other S tier, like, group? Like, there is, like, this line in between them almost, where yeah, you need to put time into them. Whereas the others, I think they are, you still want time into them, but they definitely spike a lot earlier into the mastery curve, and that makes them, like, I'd say, yeah, not more rewarding. How would I describe it? They're good to recommend S tier champions, but if you really want the the best things to invest the time into at the moment, then I do think Fiora and Aurelia really take it like as the main like 2 champions here. Anyway, Singed sits in this tier. He's very niche in the way and like unique in the way he functions, but there's no doubt about the fact that Singed is really, really good at the moment. Like Kled and Singed, I think, really have strengths in the fact that you're not going to see them a lot, and that makes them a bit harder to play against. But yeah, they're really good at the moment, so they're definitely like worth considering. Other picks include the likes of Scion and Malphite, who recent jungle buffs helped these 2 champions. In the case of Malphite, you can steal away camps, which is quite nice if you are able to get that kind of like leverage in lane, which honestly, in the current state of the game, you can sometimes. Like, both Grasp and Comet Malphite are pretty solid. Comet Malphite really benefited from sustained nerfs to other champions. It makes it a lot more, you're a lot easier, oh god, English, you're able to bully people out of lane a lot more consistently, which is really nice on this champion in the right spot. So Malphite went from being like a B tier to like an S tier option in recent patches. I think if you find the right spot to play this champion, he's very good. And the nice thing about Malphite, you do not need to sink time into him. He has a very, very accessible like mastery curve, and that makes him like someone, if you have a basic understanding of the kit, you can pick him in the right spots and you will get value out of the champion. The other picks, in the case of Sion, he is probably the #1 go-to Stonewall top laner. Is he good for winning games? Like, for individual agency, no, not really. Like, you want other top laners if you want to actually just generally carry the game. But if you are looking for a champion which can stonewall almost every top laner in the game and have some level of individual, some level of just durability and tankiness, he is the go-to option in that regard. If you're looking for a bit more individual agency, I would still recommend Mordekaiser and Set over him. I think Mordekaiser is a great AP champion to go to at the moment. Has a lot of really good matchups and can definitely be really oppressive in the right situations. And the additional build flexibility is quite nice on the champion. Set, obviously, the Stridebreaker Overlord's core is really doing quite well on him at the moment. It just gives him a lot of it gives him a lot of damage and tankiness, and the upfront burst through the W, almost 2 items, like, you can swing fights so nicely with it, so definitely something to consider when playing the champion. I still have Olaf and Kayle in this tier. I think Kayle is my #1 recommendation for like a scaling pick, where if you see the matchup you want to take her into, I think she's incredibly good in that state, and the recent buffs to her, and generally across the season, she's been, well, I see recent buffs, the buffs she received towards the end of last season, and generally the current state of like the game with like Atakan and the fact that Baron got pushed back and waves are like, you are less likely to be frozen on, and like waves traditionally and like the XP range going up like really helped her. Like, there's just so many changes that really benefited her this season, which is why she like has maintained her spot within the S tier. Olaf, I think, as a counter pick option is incredible. There are spots where Olaf looks like absurd, and then you're sat on like Stridebreaker, DD kind of core, and you just steamroll games. Like, there are spots where this champion completely runs the game and looks incredibly good as an option. So I'd recommend him, just having him as this checkmate factor. This like, I will win the game if I lock this champion in, because it makes you so like threatening as an as a player. It just gives you this really threatening option of a champion. Oh, my 2 S+ champions, I still recommend Urgot. This champion is still in an incredibly good spot this season, with the clear breakpoints and spikes within his kit via level 9, the Cleaver, the Sterox when you're like fighting the Atakan. He's incredible for average brackets, and I recommend him primarily as like the #1 go-to. That being said, Zaheen is probably just the best champion in the game at the moment. He is blatantly overpowered as I'm recording this video, and like, as long as you have like 5 to 10 games in him, you are going to be able to do a lot in games. So like, I mean, the investment you need to put into him doesn't like match the kind of like standard curve at the moment, and I think, I mean, he's just too strong. Like, I could say a lot of things, but right now he is just blatantly overpowered, and I do think he'll get hotfix this patch, so do be aware of that if you are playing the champion. That might happen eventually, but yeah, those are my thoughts for the 25.23 Toplane Tierlist. I know I'm rambling a lot in this video. I apologize about that, but yeah, I had some thoughts about some things, but yeah, anyway, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.